The morning air was cool and quiet, the kind of peace Ethan Thompson lived for. Birds chirped over the lake, mist rolled across the hills, and the smell of pine drifted through the valley. He walked out from his cabin holding his coffee mug, expecting to start his day with the same routine. Check the barn, feed the animals, and fix the broken fence post near the creek. But as he reached the small dirt path leading to his field, something felt off. Too much open space. Too much silence. His boots slowed in the mud. The red shape that had always stood proudly by the waterline was gone. Ethan stopped dead, his breath catching in his throat. Where his grandfather's barn once stood, a barn built with calloused hands and decades of care, there was now nothing but shattered wood, piles of dust, and metal nails glittering under the morning sun. His heart pounded. He dropped his coffee, the cup shattering against the dirt. The smell of bitter roast mixed with the scent of fresh-cut lumber and diesel. Then he saw the sign planted in the ground like a slap to the face. In big bold letters, it read, HOA Demolition Order, Unauthorized Structure. Below it was a smaller note with cold, printed words, Violation of Aesthetic Code 4B, Non-Compliant Building Design. Action approved by HOA Committee. Ethan stood still for several seconds, unable to process what he was reading. His grandfather had built that barn before the HOA even existed. Before there were paved roads. Before this neighborhood of shiny houses and rich weekenders had ever been imagined. That barn had held his family's tools, his memories, his life's history. And now it was gone, ripped away under the excuse of aesthetic rules. A crunch of gravel behind him made him turn. 3 people were standing near the remains, clipboard in hand, hard hats on, and the same smug look that only power without conscience could create. Karen stood at the front, sunglasses covering her eyes even though the sun hadn't fully risen. She was the HOA president, the kind of woman who thought her position made her royalty. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said in that tone that always sounded polite but carried poison underneath. "I was hoping you'd be here to see the progress." Ethan's voice was calm, but there was steel under it. "Progress?" "Yes," she said, flipping a page on her clipboard. "Your barn was found to be in violation of our new community aesthetic standards. The color, the size, and the style didn't match approved designs." He blinked at her, his jaw tightening. "That barn has been here longer than your community, longer than this HOA, longer than any of those houses you call approved. You had no right." Karen smiled faintly, like a teacher explaining something to a stubborn child. "We gave you multiple warnings. We're simply following policy." "What warnings?" he demanded. "I never received a single letter." "Perhaps they got lost in the mail," she said, clearly amused. Behind her, the 2 men, Tom and Brent, both board members, avoided eye contact. They looked uncomfortable, but not enough to speak up. Karen gestured toward the pile of wood. "Don't take it personally, Ethan. We're just trying to improve the neighborhood. Clean lines, matching colors, consistent design. It's about maintaining property value." Ethan took a slow step forward. His voice dropped low. "That barn was part of my family's history. You destroyed something irreplaceable." Karen shrugged. It didn't match. He looked over her shoulder at the sparkling blue lake behind her, the lake the HOA loved to advertise in their brochures. "Rules are rules," she added with that fake smile. Ethan didn't respond. He just stood there, his hands curling into fists at his sides. She turned and began walking toward her car. "If you'd like to appeal," she said over her shoulder, "take it up with the committee." Ethan knew the committee. Her husband sat on it. Her cousin handled neighborhood compliance. And her friend's real estate agent was the one who kept bragging that lakefront homes were about to rise in value. It was a rigged game. He wouldn't win it their way. "Oh," Karen said, pausing at her car, "we'll be sending an invoice for the demolition costs. It's standard procedure." She smiled one last time. "Have a nice day." Ethan watched her drive off, the tires crunching over the gravel road, her taillights flashing like 2 red eyes fading into the trees. He stood in silence, staring at the wreckage of his barn. His grandfather's old weather vane lay bent in the dirt. The carved initials, E.T. Sr., still faintly visible on one of the splintered boards. He knelt down and touched the wood, the rough edges biting into his fingertips. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. But his heart hardened like stone. A low hum of machinery drifted from the direction of the lake. The HOA workers were trimming hedges, cleaning the walking path, polishing the benches, all while his land sat scarred and broken. He turned toward the water. The sun glimmered on the surface, the reflection sharp and calm. Under that lake was a system of pipes, channels, and gates, built decades ago by his grandfather. It was old, but it worked, and the valve that controlled the water flow sat squarely on his property, hidden behind the grove of oak trees near the dam. The HOA had never bothered to check the land surveys. They assumed they owned everything near the water. They didn't. Ethan did. He walked slowly toward the dam, each step deliberate. The sound of the water rushing beneath it filled his ears. He crouched beside the old steel mechanism, brushing away a layer of dirt. His grandfather had shown him how to operate it when he was a boy. The handle was rusted but intact, a long lever that, when pulled, would drain the lake downstream. It hadn't been moved in years. He ran his hand over the metal, feeling the weight of generations in the cool surface. Rules are rules, Karen's voice echoed in his head. He looked at the glimmering houses across the lake, the manicured lawns, the flower beds, the glass decks that sparkled in the morning sun. All of it existed because of this dam. Because of the water his family had controlled for decades. Without it, the lake would dry up in days, leaving mud, dead fish, and rotten stench where beauty once was. Ethan smiled faintly, not out of malice, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew balance was about to be restored. He stood and walked back toward his cabin. On the porch sat a stack of mail, 5 new envelopes, all from the HOA. He didn't even open them. He threw them into the fire pit. They burned fast, curling into black ash. He spent the afternoon walking through his field, picking up what pieces of the barn he could salvage. Each plank told a story. Each nail reminded him of the work his family had poured into this land. When the sun began to set, the orange glow hit the lake like fire on glass. He stood on the hill watching it, his eyes tracing the reflection of the homes on the water's surface. The same people who called his barn ugly now stared out proudly from their patios at a view that existed only because of him. He thought about confronting them again, shouting, demanding justice. But then he remembered how Karen smirked, how she said it didn't match. He realized something important. There was no reasoning with people who valued paint color over principle. They'd already declared war. They just didn't know it yet. That night, as the neighborhood slept under its blanket of silence, Ethan returned to the dam. The moonlight reflected off the steel valve, turning it silver. He didn't touch it yet. He just stood there, thinking. He thought of his grandfather's voice, "Son, never start a fight you can't finish." Ethan smiled faintly. "Don't worry, Grandpa," he whispered. "This one'll finish itself." The water rushed beneath his feet, steady and powerful. He could almost hear it waiting. Not yet, he thought. Not tonight. He wasn't driven by anger but by patience. The same patience that built that barn. The same patience that survived wars, storms, and greedy men with fancy titles. He turned away, heading back toward the cabin. He would rebuild, but not the way they expected. The HOA thought they'd taken his property and his pride. But all they'd really done was remind him of what he controlled. And when the time came, he'd show them that some rules, especially the ones written by corrupt hands, were meant to be broken. The stars shimmered over the silent lake, and somewhere beneath the water, the dam valve waited, old, loyal, and ready. The next morning, the sun rose over the quiet lake, casting its reflection on the water like nothing had happened. The birds sang, the wind moved through the trees, and the world pretended that everything was normal. But Ethan didn't feel peace. The empty space where his barn once stood was a wound that wouldn't heal. The HOA thought they could bury his family's history under rules and signatures, but they didn't know him. They didn't know what kind of man they had provoked. He wasn't one for shouting or threats. He was a man of patience, of quiet precision. That was the kind of strength his grandfather had taught him. Never react in anger, plan in silence, and when the moment comes, strike with purpose. Ethan spent that entire day walking the property line, retracing the old survey markers his grandfather had shown him as a boy. The HOA liked to think the lake was theirs, but the original deeds told a different story. The dam, the valve, and the flow system had all been built by his family generations ago to control flooding in the valley. The HOA's prized resort lake existed only because of the Thompson family. Without that dam, the lake would be nothing but cracked mud and dry weeds. And the best part? Every inch of it, the water gate, the valve, and the surrounding land, was on his property, legally and completely. The thought made Ethan's jaw tighten with a quiet, grim satisfaction. The HOA had taken his barn, but they had done it blind. They'd struck the man who controlled their water supply. And they didn't even know it. That evening, Ethan sat at his old wooden table, spreading out dusty blueprints and legal papers. He ran his fingers over the faded ink of his grandfather's handwriting, notations about water flow rates, dam reinforcements, and maintenance logs. Everything had been recorded. His grandfather was a man of detail, a man who never trusted others to guard what he built. Ethan smiled faintly. "You were right, old man," he whispered. "Paper beats talk every time." Outside, the lake shimmered under the fading sun. The reflection of Karen's grand house at the far end of the water looked like a glittering palace, her precious aesthetic view that she had ruined his barn to protect. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, sat back, and thought about every fine, every threat, every smug smile she had given him. Then he opened his laptop and began typing. No angry letter, no complaint, no appeal. He started drafting a report, a record of the HOA's illegal demolition, complete with photos and documents. But not for the HOA. No, this one was for the county office, the state historical board, and a few people who would take great interest in how a homeowners association destroyed a century-old structure without a proper permit. When he finished, he saved the files, printed copies, and placed them in a neat folder. He wasn't ready to send it yet. Not until he had something else, a little more leverage. Over the next few days, Ethan watched and listened. The HOA trucks came and went, inspecting the lake walkway, repainting the benches, putting up banners for the upcoming Lakewood Summer Gala. Karen strutted around with her clipboard like she ran the town, barking orders at workers and reminding everyone that the HOA was beautifying the community. Beautifying, he thought bitterly, by destroying anything that didn't fit her image. He spent his nights down by the dam, checking the old mechanisms. The metal gate was stiff, but the valve still worked perfectly. He cleaned the rust off the handle, greased the hinges, and made sure the old pressure gauge was functional. It felt almost symbolic, reviving what they had ignored. The same tool that kept their perfect world afloat sat quietly on his land, under his control. When he turned the valve slightly, he could feel the vibration through the ground, the raw power of the water pressing to be released. He didn't pull it yet. Not even close. This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about teaching a lesson, and making sure when it happened, there'd be no turning back. On the third day, he visited the county records office to request copies of property maps. The clerk, an older woman who knew his family, looked over the request and nodded. "Thompson land," she said with a small smile. "Been in your family forever, hasn't it?" "Since before the lake existed," Ethan said. "And before that HOA started acting like they built it." The woman shook her head. "I've seen those people come in here all fancy, trying to push land boundaries. Don't let them fool you, son. That dam's yours." Ethan thanked her, took the maps, and walked out with the confirmation he needed. The documents clearly showed the dam's valve, the outflow gate, and the retaining walls, all inside his property line by 30 feet. The HOA had absolutely no claim to it. That night, he took the papers and pinned them to his wall beside the old blueprints. Then he opened his drawer and took out something he hadn't used in years, a small metal tag on a chain. It was his grandfather's identification tag from when he served in the war, engraved with his initials and the date the dam was finished. Ethan held it in his hand for a long time. "They took your barn, Grandpa," he said quietly. "But they forgot the part of this land that still answers to us." Over the next few days, the HOA tried to pile on more pressure. They sent new fines, unapproved landscape changes, failure to maintain fence appearance, use of unsanctioned materials. They even claimed his tractor violated community vehicle visibility standards. Every letter they sent went straight into his fireplace. The flames devoured them one by one. On the 5th day, Karen herself showed up again, stepping out of her shiny SUV in her heels and perfect hair. "Mr. Thompson," she called, walking toward him as if she owned his land. "I see you're still having trouble following regulations." Ethan didn't answer. He was repairing a section of his old fence. "I'll remind you," she continued, "that this community expects cooperation. You could still appeal to the committee if you—" "The committee?" he interrupted, still hammering a nail into the post. "You mean your husband, your cousin, and your real estate partner?" "I'll pass." Her jaw tightened. "You're being unreasonable." "No," he said calmly. "I'm being patient." She tilted her head, pretending confusion. "Is that a threat?" He finally looked at her, his eyes cold and steady. "No. It's a fact." For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, fear, or maybe realization, but she masked it with a smirk. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Thompson," she said, turning to leave. "The HOA can make your life very difficult." "You already did," he said quietly. She didn't respond. Her car tires crunched on the gravel as she sped away, dust rising behind her like smoke. Ethan watched until the sound faded. Then he walked down to the dam again. The sun was setting, painting the lake gold, and the houses across the water glowed like they were dipped in fire. The reflection was beautiful, almost perfect, too perfect. He placed his hand on the cool metal lever and listened to the deep hum beneath his feet. The sound of control. The sound of balance. He could end their illusion anytime he wanted. Not yet, he thought again. He wasn't ready to turn the valve. Not until he had everything in place. For now, he'd let the HOA believe they'd won. Let them keep smiling, hosting meetings, and bragging about their precious view. Because soon, that view would change forever. And when it did, every smug smile in Lakewood would vanish beneath the sound of rushing water. Ethan turned away from the dam as night fell, the moon reflecting off the lake that still looked calm, unaware that the man who built it now held its fate in his hands. The morning began with an odd tension that hung in the air like static before a storm. The lake shimmered under the rising sun, perfectly calm, perfectly fake. To anyone else it was just another day, but for Ethan, it was the calm before a shift he'd been planning for days. He woke early, made his coffee, and stared out the window at the water that had become both his enemy's pride and his secret weapon. The HOA had overplayed their hand. They'd pushed too far, too arrogantly, and now they were standing on a foundation built entirely on his property. The irony made him smile, but not out of joy. It was the kind of slow, bitter satisfaction that came when justice was about to balance the scales. Ethan wasn't a man of speeches or shouting matches. He was a man who acted when it mattered. So that morning, he put on his old work boots, grabbed his worn leather notebook, and walked to the HOA's monthly meeting. They didn't expect him to show up. They thought they had broken him. The meeting was held in the community center near the lake, a building the HOA loved to show off in their newsletters. The walls were lined with framed photos of happy families, awards for Best Maintained Community, and a shiny plaque naming Karen as Community Leader of the Year. Ethan walked in quietly, ignoring the stares from the other homeowners. Karen looked up from her chair at the head of the long table, her perfect smile tightening when she saw him. "Mr. Thompson," she said in a tone soaked in fake courtesy, "to what do we owe this visit?" Ethan didn't sit. He simply laid a folder on the table in front of her. "You owe me 10 minutes, he said calmly. She raised an eyebrow. "We're in the middle of a meeting." "Then this is part of it." The room went silent. Karen hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. She opened the folder and began flipping through the papers. Inside were certified copies of old land deeds, blueprints, and survey maps from before the HOA existed. "These are outdated," she said, laughing softly. "They don't hold weight anymore." "Actually," Ethan said, his voice firm, "they do. Every map you've been using for your lakefront plans is built on an illegal adjustment filed by your developer 15 years ago. The dam, the water gate, and part of that shoreline walkway you love so much? They're all on private land. Mine." Karen's smile faltered, but she tried to recover. "That's ridiculous." Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a more recent document. "This one's from the county registrar. It confirms what I just said. I own the dam. I control the valve. You don't." The other board members began murmuring. One man leaned forward. "Is this true?" Karen glared at him. "His bluffing." Ethan didn't respond. He just looked her dead in the eye. "You tore down my barn for not fitting your aesthetic vision. You trespassed, destroyed private property, and laughed about it. Now you're standing on land that's only beautiful because my family made it possible. And unlike you, I've got the paperwork to prove it." Karen's composure cracked. "If you think threatening us will, this isn't a threat," he said, cutting her off. "It's a reminder. You can't bully someone who's not afraid of you." He gathered his papers, nodded to the others, and walked out. Behind him, whispers erupted like a storm. He could hear one of the board members say, "If he's right, we're in serious trouble." Outside, Ethan took a deep breath. The wind coming off the lake felt colder than usual, sharper, as if the world itself was waiting for what came next. He didn't need to destroy them that day. He just needed them to know the truth, that their power was borrowed, and he could take it back whenever he chose. That evening, as the HOA scrambled to verify his claims, Ethan walked the perimeter of the dam again. He checked the steel bolts, the hinges, the pressure valve. Everything was solid. Everything was ready. He had no intention of flooding the valley or causing chaos. He wasn't reckless. But the HOA's lake had one vulnerability. It depended entirely on the steady flow from his dam. All it would take to cripple them was a small adjustment. Just enough to show them how fragile their comfort was. He returned home, waited until night fell, and then walked back to the dam with a flashlight. The crickets chirped, the air was still, and the moon hung low over the lake, casting silver light on the water. He reached the old valve, its metal glistening faintly. With a steady hand, he turned it, just a fraction, just enough for the pressure to shift. The sound was low and deep, a distant groan as water began to redirect through the underground channel. He stood there for a long moment, watching the gauge needle drop slightly. The water level wouldn't change immediately. It would take days for anyone to notice. But when they did, it would be too late to stop it. Over the next few days, Ethan went about his life like nothing had happened. He fixed his fence, mowed his field, and nodded politely to neighbors who pretended not to stare at the ruins of his barn. But around the fifth morning, the change began. The lake's edge had pulled back nearly a foot. The ducks waddled awkwardly on the exposed mud. By noon, homeowners were standing on their decks, pointing at the shrinking shoreline. Karen's phone must have exploded with calls, because soon she was out by the lake with her clipboard, shouting into it like a general losing a battle. "Check the pumps. Increase the flow. Find the leak," she barked. But there was no leak. The pipes were fine. The pumps were fine. Everything was working exactly as it should, except the valve. Ethan sat on his porch that evening, sipping his coffee, watching her pace in panic. The fountain in front of her house sputtered once, twice, then stopped completely. He couldn't hear her, but he could see the frustration in her body language. She turned toward his property once or twice, as if suspecting something, but she couldn't prove it. That was the beauty of it. He hadn't broken a single law. He hadn't trespassed or vandalized a thing. He was simply managing his own land. The HOA, however, was reaping the harvest of their arrogance. The next day, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Ethan didn't attend this one. He already knew what would happen. They'd argue, blame each other, hire contractors, and waste money trying to fix what wasn't broken. And while they did, the lake would keep sinking, inch by inch. That night, he drove out to the dam again, not to adjust anything, but to watch. The moonlight shimmered across the exposed rocks at the lake's edge. The water was still beautiful, but it no longer looked untouchable. For the first time, Ethan saw the HOA's empire the way it really was, fragile, dependent, and temporary. He whispered softly, "Now you understand what power really means." The sound of the flowing water beneath him was steady, like the heartbeat of justice. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need revenge in flames. He just needed the truth to do its quiet work. And the truth, he thought, always finds its way to the surface. Just like the bottom of that lake soon would be by the end of the week. The neighborhood was in chaos. What had once been Lakewood's pride, a mirror-clear lake surrounded by luxury homes and manicured lawns, was now a sinking pond of confusion. The water level had dropped almost 2 feet, and the shoreline that used to glisten under the sun now showed patches of cracked mud and dying grass. The HOA board was panicking. Their residents were demanding answers, their landscapers couldn't hide the damage, and the lakefront properties, those same expensive homes Karen bragged about in every meeting, were losing value fast. Meanwhile, Ethan stayed calm. Every morning, he drank his coffee on the porch, watching the mess unfold from his side of the property. From there, he could see Karen pacing along the lakeside path, yelling into her phone, waving her clipboard at contractors. She had no idea that the man sitting quietly at the top of the hill was the only one who could stop what was happening. And Ethan wasn't about to offer help. On the 4th morning, he saw her marching up his driveway. Her SUV screeched to a stop, tires kicking up dust. She stepped out wearing her designer sunglasses, heels sinking slightly into the dirt, her expression carved from pure fury. Ethan didn't move. He stayed seated, his hat pulled low, his cup steady in his hand. "Mr. Thompson," she barked, stomping toward him. "We need to talk." He glanced up slowly, his tone flat. "About what?" "Don't play games," she snapped. "The lake is draining. Someone's tampering with the dam." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Someone? Don't act innocent. You're the only one with access down there." He sipped his coffee. "Access?" "Yes, and we both know that dam sits close to your land," she said, her voice sharp, almost cracking. "We've had engineers check the valves, but there's no public entry. That means it must be you." Ethan stood slowly, setting his mug down. He walked a few steps closer, his calm presence making her shift uncomfortably. "You're right," he said finally. "It is on my land. In fact, the whole dam is." She froze. "That's not possible. The HOA owns that infrastructure." Ethan pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. It was an original survey map, stamped by the county decades ago. "Your HOA doesn't own a single bolt of that dam," he said evenly. "It was built by my grandfather before this community existed. The water rights and the maintenance rights are both in my family name. You can call your lawyers if you don't believe me." Karen looked at the document, scanning it frantically. Her fake confidence faltered. "That can't be legal anymore. There must have been a transfer." "There wasn't," Ethan interrupted. "You and your board never checked the deeds before you started building your resort lake. You just assumed everything you saw belonged to you." She tried to recover, straightening her shoulders. "Then we'll file for ownership. The HOA has rights to protect community property." "Except it's not community property," he said, his tone calm but cold. "It's mine." She took a step back, her voice dropping low. "Are you threatening me?" Ethan smiled slightly. "No. You already threatened me when you destroyed my barn." Her face flushed red. "That was a code violation." "That was trespassing and destruction of private property," he said. "You broke the law, Karen. And now, the law's on my side." For the first time since he'd known her, she didn't have a quick comeback. Her lips trembled slightly before she snapped. "If you're doing something to that dam, you'll regret it. The HOA will sue you into the ground." Ethan tilted his head. You mean the same HOA that doesn't even own the lake? The one that's about to get fined for unauthorized land development? You might want to worry about your own paperwork before you start threatening mine. She glared at him, eyes burning with anger. You can't get away with this. I already did, he said quietly. She spun around, storming back to her car, but before getting in, she turned once more. If you drain that lake, you'll destroy this community. Ethan looked past her toward the lake, its surface lower than ever, sunlight glinting off the wet mud. Maybe it's time this community saw what happens when they take what doesn't belong to them. She drove off, the tires throwing gravel behind her. Ethan stood there, watching her go. He wasn't smiling, but there was a calm in his eyes, a soldier's calm, the kind that comes when you know the battle is already won. Over the next few days, the HOA scrambled. They sent letters accusing him of sabotage and reckless conduct. They tried to get the county involved, but when inspectors came, they confirmed Ethan's documents were legitimate. The HOA had no authority over his dam, his water, or his property. The inspectors couldn't even step onto his land without permission. And Ethan didn't give it. By the end of the week, Karen's tone had shifted from fury to desperation. She came again, this time without her heels or sunglasses, her hair unkempt, the stress showing on her face. Ethan, she said, trying to sound calm. Look, I know we've had our differences, but this is out of hand. The lake is drying up. People are furious. They're threatening to leave. Can't we work something out? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked past her toward the lake, where boats now sat crooked on the muddy ground. Work something out, he said finally. You mean like when I asked you to stop the demolition? She swallowed hard. That was different. It was about community standards. And this, he said, his voice sharpening, is about natural balance. She flinched. You're punishing everyone for one mistake. You're right, he said, his eyes cold. It was one mistake. Yours. But I didn't make this personal. You did. She took a shaky breath. What do you want? Respect, he said simply. And acknowledgement. That barn was my family's legacy. You took it without thought, without care. You destroyed a century of history for a prettier view. I don't want money. I want the HOA to admit what it did and restore what it broke. Karen hesitated, her pride fighting her survival instinct. Finally, she said, I can't make promises. The board's finished, he interrupted. The only thing you can do now is tell the truth. Her eyes hardened. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? No, Ethan said softly. I'm just the man who turned off your lake. She stared at him, speechless, then turned and walked away, shoulders stiff, her silence heavier than any argument. That night, as the sun set behind the hills, Ethan stood by the dam, looking out over the drained basin. The moonlight shimmered on the little that remained of the water, and the cracked ground glowed pale beneath it. The sound of frogs and crickets filled the air, a quiet reminder that nature didn't care about property lines or HOA rules. Ethan reached down and touched the valve handle again. He could open it, refill the lake, end all this chaos. But not yet. They hadn't learned enough. They hadn't felt the loss he had felt when his barn fell. So he turned away, letting the silence of the night stretch on. The lake would remain low until the HOA learned what respect meant, and by the look of things, that lesson was just beginning. The next few weeks tore the illusion of the HOA's power apart piece by piece. What used to be a peaceful, postcard-perfect community had become a battlefield of whispers, lawsuits, and panic. The lake that once shimmered blue and reflected their expensive homes was now half empty, a cracked, muddy scar running through the heart of Lakewood. The HOA's prized fountain stood useless, tilted on dry ground. The walking paths smelled of rot and algae. Residents who had once boasted about lakefront living were now shouting at Karen in every meeting. You promised this would never happen, one homeowner screamed. Our property values are plummeting, yelled another. Karen sat at the head of the table, her hair disheveled, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Every time she tried to speak, someone interrupted. The HOA board, once her loyal circle of power, now looked ready to abandon her too. Leonard, the treasurer, wiped sweat from his forehead. Maybe we can negotiate with Thompson, he muttered. He's the one controlling the dam. No! Karen snapped, slamming her hand on the table. He's trying to humiliate us. If we give in now, we lose everything. Leonard leaned forward. We already have. Across the neighborhood, the panic grew. Local news had caught wind of the story. HOA feud drains lake, community in crisis. Reporters came with cameras, filming the cracked earth where boats now lay stranded. Ethan watched them from his porch, sipping his morning coffee like a man watching the end of a bad movie he'd already seen coming. He didn't gloat, but he didn't feel guilty either. They had taken his family's barn without permission, and now they were learning what it felt like to lose something they thought was untouchable. The difference was, he hadn't used a wrecking crew. He'd only used the truth, and a little patience. One afternoon, while he was repairing the old barn foundation, Leonard drove up the hill in a silver car. The man stepped out nervously, glancing over his shoulder like he didn't want to be seen. "Mr. Thompson," he called. Ethan didn't look up. "You lost." "No, I'm here to talk." Ethan set down his hammer. "Then talk." Leonard approached slowly, hands in his pockets. "Look, this whole thing's gotten out of hand. Karen, she went too far. We all see that now. But if you don't open the valve soon, the entire lake ecosystem could collapse. Fish are dying, birds are leaving. It's turning into a disaster." "Wasn't it already a disaster when you tore down my barn?" Ethan asked, his tone even but sharp. Leonard sighed. "You have every right to be angry. I get it. But this is bigger than her. Families are hurting. Kids can't swim. The summer festival's been cancelled. You've made your point." Ethan stared at him for a long moment. "You're right," he said finally. "It's bigger than her. And that's the problem. You all let her run this place like a kingdom, and no one spoke up. Not until the water dried up." Leonard opened his mouth, but Ethan continued. "You could have stopped her. You could have told her the barn was mine. But you didn't. You just let her destroy what she didn't understand. So now, you'll watch your lake go the same way." Leonard's face turned pale. "So this is revenge?" "No," Ethan said quietly. "This is consequence." Leonard left, defeated, and Ethan watched his car disappear down the hill. By evening, storm clouds gathered above the valley. Thunder rolled across the horizon, and heavy rain began to fall. The next morning, the lake had barely risen an inch. The dam was still closed tight, holding back the water. The HOA thought the rain would save them, but it only made the empty lake look sadder, puddles forming in the cracked mud like tears on a broken mirror. Karen, desperate, started spreading rumors that Ethan had sabotaged the dam to destroy the community. She filed complaints with the county, but when investigators arrived, they left shaking their heads. "He's done nothing illegal," one of them said in front of the board. "The dam is on his property. He has every right to maintain it however he sees fit." That sentence broke the HOA completely. Homeowners started resigning from the association. Some demanded refunds. Others filed their own lawsuits against Karen for mishandling funds and approving an illegal demolition. Within 2 weeks, the HOA's legal defense fund was empty. Their lawyer quit. The bank accounts were frozen pending investigation. The same people who had once enforced endless rules now couldn't pay their own electricity bill for the community office. Karen was finished, but she didn't know it yet. One morning, she marched up to Ethan's property again, drenched in sweat and pride. "You think you've won?" she shouted. "You're destroying innocent people's lives." Ethan stood by the fence, hands resting on the wood. "I didn't destroy anything," he said evenly. "You did." "You're a monster," she hissed. "You think anyone's going to respect you after this?" Ethan stepped closer. "Respect isn't something you demand, Karen. It's something you earn. And you burned yours the day you bulldozed my family's history for a prettier view." Her voice cracked. You can't keep it this way forever. Ethan's eyes met hers, cold and steady. I don't have to. Forever's not the point. The point is that you understand you never owned this place. You just borrowed it. And now, the land's taking it back. She glared at him one last time before storming off into the rain. That evening, Ethan went down to the dam for the first time in days. The air was heavy with the scent of wet soil and pine. The metal valve gleamed slick under the drizzle. He crouched beside it, running his hand over the handle. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It wasn't even about the barn. It was about balance. His grandfather had always said that land has memory, that it remembers kindness and cruelty alike. Ethan believed that now more than ever. He turned the valve slowly, carefully, letting the pressure shift until a deep rumble echoed through the dam. Water began to trickle again, building into a steady stream that poured back into the lakebed. By morning, the water level had started to rise. But the damage was already done. The HOA was in ruins, Karen's reputation destroyed, and the county had opened a full investigation into the illegal demolition. When the news finally broke, HOA faces lawsuit over veterans' historic barn. Ethan's name spread across the state. But he didn't care about fame. He didn't talk to reporters, didn't give interviews. He stayed home, rebuilt his barn plank by plank, each nail a small act of reclaiming what they had tried to erase. And when he finished, the new barn stood taller than before, its red paint shining brighter against the green hills. From the porch, he could see the lake slowly returning to life. Birds flew overhead again. The air smelled of rain and redemption. The HOA had tried to destroy his legacy, but instead, they'd given it new meaning. Ethan smiled to himself, a quiet smile, the kind only a man who'd fought with patience could wear. They'd taken his barn, but he'd taken back everything else. The sun rose through the misty clouds the next morning, casting a soft golden glow over the valley. The lake, once dry and cracked, now shimmered again with a faint reflection of the sky. The water flowed steadily from the dam, filling the basin inch by inch. The birds had returned, gliding low across the surface. For the first time in months, the land looked alive again. Ethan stood at the edge of his field, watching the slow miracle unfold, the faint smile on his face hidden behind his calm eyes. He didn't bring attention to what he had done. There was no announcement, no dramatic speech. He had simply turned the valve, the same way he turned the tide of his own story, with quiet precision. Down by the lake, the few remaining HOA members stood in disbelief. They couldn't understand it. After weeks of chaos, fighting, and legal letters, the water was coming back as if the land itself had forgiven them. But it hadn't. It was Ethan who had decided to restore balance, and that made all the difference. Karen, however, didn't share the relief. She stood alone near her now rotting deck, staring at the rising water with a hollow look. The once confident woman who had ruled the neighborhood like a queen now looked like a ghost of herself. The board had dissolved, the lawsuits were mounting, and she had lost her home's worth along with her reputation. The HOA's name had become a joke across town. Lakewood, people called it, the lake that vanished because of greed. But Ethan wasn't thinking about her anymore. His focus was on rebuilding. Every day, he worked on his new barn, one plank, one nail at a time. He used the salvaged wood from the old structure where he could, sanding it, treating it, breathing life back into what they tried to destroy. It wasn't just a building, it was a promise. The townspeople began stopping by, offering to help. Veterans from nearby neighborhoods came to lend a hand, men who had served like him and knew the weight of loss. They didn't ask for details, but they knew enough. Word had spread that a corrupt HOA had targeted a veteran and lost everything trying to break him. He didn't fight back with anger, one old man said. He fought back with patience. By the time the new barn was finished, it stood taller than before, the red paint gleaming proudly under the sun. A small bronze plaque hung by the door, engraved with the words, "For every man who's been told he doesn't belong on his own land." When Ethan stepped back to look at it, he felt something inside him finally settle. It wasn't victory he felt, it was peace. A peace that came not from revenge, but from justice delivered in silence. Meanwhile, the HOA's collapse became complete. Karen's husband had left the community, taking their savings with him. The once proud board members sold their homes and moved away. The county's final audit confirmed that the HOA had operated illegally for years, approving demolitions without permits, enforcing made-up rules, and misusing community funds. The state revoked their license to operate, and the Lakewood Homeowners Association was officially dissolved. The signs that once displayed proud HOA community were taken down, the posts left bare and splintered. Where Karen's empire once stood, there was now only silence, and water slowly returning to the lakebed she had nearly destroyed. One afternoon, as Ethan was tending to his field, a car pulled into his driveway. It was a black sedan with government plates. Two officials stepped out, polite but serious. "Mr. Thompson," one asked. "I'm with the County Restoration Office. We wanted to thank you for cooperating with our environmental report. The Historical Division has also reviewed your grandfather's documents. We're recommending this property for preservation status. Your land and the dam will be protected permanently under county law." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Protected?" "Yes, sir. Your grandfather's construction predates the HOA by decades. It's considered a piece of local heritage now. No future development or association will be able to touch it." The second official smiled. "They'll have to go through you for everything." Ethan chuckled softly, shaking their hands. "That's how it's always been." When they left, he walked down to the dam once more. The metal handle gleamed in the sunlight, steady and silent. He rested his hand on it, remembering the first day he'd touched it after the barn's destruction. The anger, the restraint, the heavy silence. Now it felt different. It felt lighter, as if his grandfather's spirit was there beside him, nodding with quiet pride. The sound of rushing water filled the air again, deep and powerful, echoing through the valley like a heartbeat returning to life. That night, under the silver moon, Ethan sat by the fire pit with a few of his neighbors. The air smelled of pine and smoke, and the distant lake shimmered under the starlight. One of the men turned to him and said, "You know, you could have destroyed them completely. You could have drained that lake forever." Ethan poked the fire with a stick and said simply, "Sometimes letting them drown isn't justice. Making them see what they built on lies, that's enough." The group fell silent. The fire crackled softly. In the distance, a frog croaked by the revived water, the sound slow and steady, like a promise kept. The land was healing, and so was he. The next morning, when he walked out of his cabin, the first light hit the new barn's red walls, glowing like fire against the mist. The lake behind it was full again, calm and perfect. To anyone else, it might have looked like peace had returned. But Ethan knew better. Peace wasn't given, it was earned, one battle at a time, and this one had ended exactly the way it was meant to. He looked out over the valley, the land his family had built and protected for generations, and whispered, they thought they could take it. But this land always remembers who it belongs to. Then, as the sun climbed higher and the water rippled under the morning breeze, Ethan walked back toward his barn, not as a victim, not as a fighter, but as a man who had restored his family's honor with silence, patience, and a single turn of a valve. Months passed, and the scars left by the HOA's arrogance began to fade from the land but not from memory. The lake sparkled once again, the birds had returned, and the smell of wildflowers floated on the breeze. Yet beneath the calm surface, every home in the valley carried a quiet reminder of what had happened, how one man's patience had undone an empire of greed. Ethan lived peacefully, tending to his land, rebuilding what mattered. The new barn stood proudly on the hill, its bright red walls visible from across the water. People often drove by just to see it, some out of respect, others out of guilt. Those who had mocked him before now waved when they passed, offering apologies that came too late. But Ethan wasn't bitter anymore. He didn't need revenge. He already had justice. One morning, a letter arrived, official, clean, with the county seal on it. It wasn't from the HOA. That name was gone forever. It was from the county itself. Inside was a certificate confirming the Thompson Dam as a protected historical landmark, ensuring that no one could ever touch it, move it, or control it again. Ethan smiled faintly as he read it, running a calloused thumb over the embossed gold seal. His grandfather's work, his family's name, would endure long after he was gone. For generations, people would remember not just the dam or the barn, but the story of how one man stood up for his land without raising his voice. That same day, he received an unexpected visitor. A small gray car pulled up the dirt road, and out stepped a woman in plain clothes, wearing a hat pulled low. It was Karen. Her posture was no longer proud or confident. She looked older somehow, tired, as though the weight of what she'd done had finally caught up to her. She approached the porch slowly, hesitating with every step. Ethan didn't speak first. He just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. "You rebuilt it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The barn?" "Yes," Ethan replied simply. "Looks better this time." She nodded, eyes darting to the red structure in the distance. "It's beautiful. Your grandfather would be proud. He would have told me not to let people like you near it again," Ethan said, his tone calm, not cruel. She winced. "I deserve that." "You deserve more," he said. "But you're here, so talk." She swallowed hard. "I wanted to apologize. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I've had time to think. I lost everything. My house, my position, my marriage. But losing that lake, it made me realize something. All of this, HOAs, property lines, control, it's meaningless when you forget respect. I didn't see that before. I do now." Ethan studied her for a long moment. Her voice wasn't fake anymore. She wasn't the same smug woman with a clipboard and a fake smile. She looked small, human, and painfully aware of her mistakes. "You didn't just forget respect," Ethan said quietly. "You forgot decency. You forgot that people built this land before papers and policies. You thought power meant ownership. It doesn't. It means responsibility." Karen nodded slowly, her eyes glassy with tears. "I know. I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. For the barn, for the letters, for all of it." Ethan didn't answer immediately. The sound of the wind filled the silence between them, rustling the tall grass. Finally, he said, "You're not the first person to let greed blind you. You just learned your lesson the hard way." She nodded again, wiping her eyes. "If you ever need anything, I don't," Ethan said, cutting her off gently. "But I hope you do something good with what's left of your life. Maybe help people instead of trying to control them." She managed a small, broken smile. "I'll try." Then she turned, walking back to her car, her figure small against the open sky. As she drove away, Ethan exhaled slowly. He didn't feel satisfaction or anger, only peace. Karen had finally understood what the lake had already learned. You can't control something you don't respect. A few days later, a group of local officials and historians came to photograph the dam for its registry. They took pictures of the barn too, documenting it as part of the Thompson heritage. One of them asked Ethan, "Sir, would you mind if we included a small plaque telling the story of what happened here?" Ethan thought for a moment, then said, "Only if you write it right." "And how's that?" the man asked. Ethan looked out at the lake, the sun glinting on the calm water, and replied, "Don't write about a man who fought back. Write about a man who reminded his town that land isn't owned, it's cared for." The historian nodded, and a month later, a new sign was placed by the lakeshore. It read, "Thompson Dam, built 1943. Protected by generations who believed in respect, not rules." Over time, the story spread beyond the county. It became local legend, the tale of the veteran whose barn was torn down by an arrogant HOA, and how he took back his dignity with patience, not violence. People began calling the area Thompson Lake again, restoring its old name. The new families who moved there came not for fancy houses or strict rules, but for peace, community, and respect for the land. Ethan grew older, his beard graying, his back slowing, but every evening, he'd sit on his porch and watch the sunset reflect off the lake. He'd smile faintly every time he saw the water glisten against the dam. It was more than just a lake now. It was a reminder, to him, to everyone, that no matter how powerful people think they are, nature and truth always find balance in the end. Sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's watching arrogance crumble and peace return in silence. As the last rays of light turned the water gold, Ethan leaned back, whispering to himself, "You can drain a lake, rebuild a barn, or break a man's patience. But you can't take away what's rooted in the land. This land remembers." And as night fell, the sound of the water rushing through the dam echoed softly, a timeless song of justice, memory, and a man who stood tall when everyone else bowed to greed.